Welcome. Thanks for coming to the PCC Forum. This is the second event of the year, and it's a very special night because we are hosting a doctoral student, Alex Rachel, from EWP, East-West Psychology, which is actually fitting because of the history of the PCC Forum. Originally, it was the Interdisciplinary Dialogue Forum, started by Adam Robert and Jamie Sosi, two alums of PCC. And the vision that they had was to bring together all of the very diverse and yet intimately related programs under the CIIS umbrella so that we could share research across disciplines. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. I think under the philosophy and religion umbrella, the axial age is something that's very familiar to us, and Alex is going to be speaking about that in a perhaps unorthodox way that we may not have considered before. But Alex Rachel, former PCC student, very glad to have you among our ranks and to have you here at CIS still in EWP working on your dissertation. Do you have a title yet, or are you still working out the details?
Still working out the details. Ecologies of the soul right now.
Beautiful. Ecologies of the soul.
Yeah.
So please sit back, relax, be ready for your mind to be expanded, and you'll have your opportunity after about a 45-minute to an hour presentation from Alex to enter into discussion and ask questions, poke and prod, applaud, whatever you'd like to do. So yeah, welcome, Alex. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's so great to be back at CIS. I'm in, I'm in writing mode. I'm not in a course. I'm not taking courses now. So it's been a long time since I've been back here, and just like the great feeling of being in these halls again. Not some nostalgia, but also just like the tremendous energy of us. It's just incredible. Really good to be back here. I really wanted to especially say thank you to PCC Forum for giving me this opportunity to speak and share this with you. Really a top-notch operation. Thank you. Tonight, I'd also like to thank all the people that are supporting the Institute and all of the beings, subtle beings, non-physical beings, and otherwise that are supporting us. In some ways, it's a very special moment for me to be able to express this particular material because it's a chance for other voices to come through. And a lot of it is this research. I would hesitate to call it my research. It's sort of like our research. It's a big community that is that's coming forward, and also so many of these ideas have been gestated in the larger morphic field of which we're all composed. So all of you, even I know most of you, but I think all of you have participated in this vision, and so it's an honor, a deep honor, the deepest honor, to be able to share it with you tonight. So if you just want to take a moment and just to ground in any of your allies, any of your ancestors, any of those wonderful beings, forces, archetypes that support you, just take a moment to invite them in, and maybe they have something to contribute tonight, and maybe they just want to listen. So whatever your guides, those presences, just invite them into this soft, nurturing space. So this evening, I'm going to present an overview of my doctoral research. But first, I want to give you just a background on what motivated me to pursue this research in the first place. So I've spent almost half of the last 15 years residing and traveling in places outside of this country. And for years, I didn't really understand what was going on with all this movement through different cultural locales. But over time, a pattern started to emerge that I was discerning. And after spending time in these other lands and with people who had spent hundreds or thousands of years on these lands, and after gaining some familiarity with the sophisticated interpretive frameworks that are taught at this institute, I began to get the impression that there were invisible presences that were associated with these lands, both faraway lands and this land as well. Over the years, as I developed practices of working with and integrating non-ordinary states of consciousness, I began to experience what seemed to me to be tentative relationships that I was developing with these invisible presences. And this research is the result of trying to make sense of those relationships. A word about why I'm presenting this material publicly. There's a lot of reasons, but there's one reason that I would like to sort of underscore. And much of what we do in this larger community, much of what passes for spiritual inquiry or presencing one's authentic truth or one's authentic self, it just takes the form of repeating the truths of others. Truths that were once very alive, but are now half dead for us. Many people, I know, many of you in this room, I know for a fact, are having profound encounters with deep spiritual realities. But sometimes in the way we interpret these encounters, we eviscerate the living heart of these encounters and replace it with the doctrines that are associated with pre-existing mystical or religious paths. And this isn't such a terrible thing. A lot of this is what religious and spiritual traditions have been, relying on an outside doctrine in order to interpret your experiences. So I feel like we owe each other better than that doctrinal interpretation. My research has been conducted in the East-West Psychology program here at the California Institute of Integral Studies. This research, it examines the possibility that non-physical entities have participated in the evolution of the collective human psyche, and that the collective human psyche might, to some extent, be constituted out of our relationships with these non-physical entities. The research methodology, it's primarily hermeneutic or interpretive, theoretical, using a participatory or transpersonal lens to interpret a heuristically generated text of my own experiences in non-ordinary states of consciousness. From the years 1998 to 2011, I conducted the heuristic phase of the research. And this was focused on the nature of the relationship between the human embodied self and what apparently were non-physical entities. During the inquiry, the heuristic data occurred in discrete events of non-ordinary states of consciousness. So these contacts took the form of psychedelic sessions, dreams, visions, or self-induced trance. As the contacts accumulated, I appended them to a text that became what I refer to as the inquiry narrative. And this is the text that I interpret in the theoretical or hermeneutic phase. So I approached the interpretation of this text wondering that if human beings are physically affected by the physical things in their environment, might the human psyche also be psychically affected by these non-physical entities? Might sustained relationships between human cultures and non-physical entities have led historically to changes in the collective psyches of those cultures? Could some entities that present as parts of the human psyche actually be understood as autonomous, non-physical presences that are just in a very deeply intimate relationship with the human psyche, such that we think that they're mine, but when in fact they're just very closely related? In analyzing the content of the inquiry narrative, the hermeneutic interpretation, it draws upon the work of a number of thinkers. People have dealt with the structure, purpose, or activity of the human soul, such as Christopher Bache and David Spangler, the nature of non-physical entities, thinkers such as Jung, James Hillman, and Orion Foxwood, and also people dealing with the evolution of human consciousness. So Jean Gebser, Ken Wilber, Teilhard de Chardin, Richard Tarnas, and Terence McKenna. In terms of approach, in terms of like the theoretical interpretive approach, this research adopts a participatory approach. And there I'm drawing on the work of people such as Jorge Ferrer, Greg LaHood, Sean Kelly, and John Heron. And I should stress that Christopher Bache's Dark Night, Early Dawn and David Spangler's Subtle Worlds are sort of stand as like the paradigmatic works for the kind of research that I'm doing. I'm really standing on their shoulders because they legitimized to a large degree this kind of research that I'm doing. Now, it's important to keep in mind the limitations of this research. All of the research that I'm going to talk about tonight, it ultimately rests on a single text that's composed of the experiences of a single person in non-ordinary states of consciousness. So the limited and necessarily subjective nature of the research cautions against a more literal or objectivist application of the research that would be more appropriate, for example, if we were doing stuff in the quantitative sciences, or if I was doing something in the quantitative sciences. So it's not only qualitative research, but it's a particularly subjective or maybe intersubjective kind of research. The value of this research is primarily visionary. So it suggests a new field of possibilities that can be explored by future researchers, as well as I'm suggesting an original theoretical framework that could possibly be used to illuminate certain areas of transpersonal, participatory, or integral studies. In assessing the value of research that's visionary, we might consider the persistence of certain global crises that are plaguing us now, and the origin of these crises in our restricted understanding of the human relationship to the living world. So, based on the work of other theorists and researchers, this discussion assumes that the human psyche exists in intimate relationship with non-physical entities. So by entity, I mean any apparently autonomous presence that behaves in a way that indicates that it might possess purposiveness or consciousness or personhood. And I'm particularly interested in non-physical entities. By human psyche, I mean the non-physical or psychological aspects of the human being that are both in their personal forms and in their transpersonal forms. And both in terms of like a personal psyche and in terms of the collective psyche. And so by collective psyche, I mean a group mind or a collective unconscious at the scale of a culture, at the scale of our whole species, or something even larger. And finally, I use the term consciousness in this discussion just to mean the mode by which a given collective psyche experiences the world. In other words, like its worldview, or cultural mentality, or mindset. Okay, so let me get into what it is that I'm suggesting here. Jean Gebser, in The Ever-Present Origin, suggests several phases of consciousness that characterize the Indo-European mind. Among them, the magic phase, the mythical phase, and the mental phase. And he's applying these to the Indo-European mind. That's where he sees them. But to a larger extent, I think we can very carefully extrapolate this to the larger human species. So assuming that we can conceive of the evolution of the human psyche in terms of these semi-discrete phases, my suggestion is this, that these stages of consciousness might have been initiated in part as a result of the various encounters of cultural psyches with various non-physical entities. Or we can consider this in a more general sense of the entire human species encountering successive waves of non-physical families of species. Because Gebser's terminology is familiar to many of us, and to honor his groundbreaking theoretical research and his work, tonight I'll be using Gebser's terms magic, mythical, and mental. But note that the way that I see these phases actually differs in some respects from the way that Gebser sees them. So how does Gebser see these phases of consciousness? So I'm sure you guys have seen many of these. You've seen a lot of stuff about Gebser. I should also say that Eric Weiss was a really good introduction to Gebser's work and helped me really understand it as well. I know a lot of you have benefited from Eric's work on Gebser. So in the magic phase, consciousness is relatively undifferentiated. It exists in a deep intimacy with nature. Nevertheless, at that time, humans possessed, in addition to language and attunement to clan, a range of powerful modes for engaging this magical world of mana-charged proto-psychic intensities in which they found themselves. Things like ritual enaction, second sight, and telepathy. Next, in the mythical phase, which corresponds to the emergence of agriculture, human consciousness came to be informed by things like complex social realities, religious complexes, and an imaginal faculty. And finally, in the mental phase, we have the emergence of the philosophical and religious monisms of the so-called axial age. And this happens in the West roughly 2,500 years ago. And to some extent, it happens across, the case could be made that it happens across the globe. And with the emergence of mental consciousness, Gebser suggests that humans, or the Indo-European, people of the Indo-European cultures, gain this ability to reason abstractly. So Richard Tarnas, in Cosmos and Psyche, he suggests a similar post-axial phase of the Western mind, characterized by the recognition of a transcendent divine reality and a concomitant psychic separation from the world. And like Gebser, he identifies a highly problematic side to this separation. For Tarnas, the Western mind comes to feel that it has, quote, a unique relationship to a transcendent divinity that is separate from and sovereign over the created world, a world that is increasingly perceived as devoid of meaning and purpose other than that associated with the human self, end quote. In its later stages, even this transcendent principle loses its meaning and power, and it leaves a vacuum that is empowered by the market and mass media to colonize the collective human psyche. So if the evolution of consciousness looks something like this, how might have non-physical entities have participated in this evolution, if at all? My interpretation of the inquiry narrative suggests the possibility that the new forms of consciousness that came to characterize each of these phases took root as human cultures negotiated and incorporated the intense and destabilizing psychic energies carried by these non-physical entities. So more specifically, I suggest that the magic phase of consciousness might have arisen out of contacts with what I call terrestrial species. That the mythical phase of consciousness came about out of contacts with what I call extraterrestrial species. And mental phase of consciousness came into being, in part, out of a relationship that was developed with what I call celestial species. Now, all of these terms, they're somewhat arbitrary. They're ways that we're trying to organize a pattern. I would be careful to, how much ontological value I'd put to these terms, but there's something going on there. So these are the terms that I'm using. Terrestrial species seem to resemble primordial serpent figures that occur in some mythical narratives. Extraterrestrial species seem to resemble the jinn of Arabic lore or the Apsara goddess figures that were evidently significantly important to the ancient cultures of the Indo-Pacific region. And celestial species, if my interpretation of the inquiry narrative is legitimate, they seem to resemble the figure of the Asura that occurs in later Hindu cosmological visions, as well as the angels and godheads of various theological canons. So, like God would be a celestial entity. James Hillman, in his book Mythic Figures, he has this amazing essay on the principle of Ananke, which means necessity. And Hillman suggests that for the ancient Greeks, the principle of Ananke was paired antagonistically with nous, in the same way that compulsion was paired with reason, and destiny was paired with the god Zeus. And Hillman observes that the Greek tragedy, the Eumenides by Aeschylus, it ends with the principle of order or reason on one hand being reconciled with Ananke on the other. And in this tragedy, the reconciliation is effected by Athena, who offers the furious spirits of necessity a place within the divine order. These spirits of Ananke are offered a sanctuary where they may reside and be honored as what the Greeks referred to as resident aliens. In this explication that Hillman does of Ananke, we have a particular mythopoetic perspective that I think effectively evokes the frustration and the torment and the antagonism that such celestial entities as Zeus or Prometheus or Nos experienced as they were encountering the limits of the immanent. And these limits of the immanent were represented by the spirits of necessity. So this is my reading of Hillman's reading of Aeschylus's reading of what was going on with the Greek psyche. So what I'm saying is that the Eumenides, it suggests this encounter of a certain psyche at a certain time with a certain kind of celestial entity, namely the Greek psyche of that time with what might be celestial entities. So if that was the Greek experience a few thousand years ago, what might be our experience as modern people of this encounter with non-physical entities? So in examining the mental structure of consciousness, we can distinguish between two phases, as both Gebser and Rick Tarnas do. On one hand, we have the cultures of the first part of the mental phase, and this is like sort of the cultures that arose in the Axial Age, and then the cultures of the second part of the phase, which would be modern cultures that in the West arose after the Renaissance about 400 years ago. So we as modern peoples, because we have an awareness that's determined most pervasively by the structure of mental consciousness, the celestial entities that might participate so profoundly in this structure of consciousness might be particularly near at hand, psychically speaking. And celestial entities, especially in their modern form, because they're so taken for granted, so involved in our perceptions of the world, that when we go to see them, we might not at first see them at all. So in the text, in the inquiry narrative that I'm interpreting, the celestial entities, they seem to be characterized by agency without limits, mastery, dominion, and with the transcendent. So my suggestion is that the focus on a transcendent divine reality that characterizes so much of axial age thought, and to some extent so much of our thought, that this focus on a transcendent, it might have emerged in part from an incorporation of the energies of celestial energies and an assimilation of these celestial entities into the collective human psyche. In particular, worldviews that considered a single divine principle, light, the soul, mind, or the human, to exist in a relationship of superiority over the world, darkness, matter, the body and sexuality, or the non-human, seem to possibly bear the stamp of incorporated celestial entities. Mythological figures of the early mental, reflecting the presence of celestial entities in the human psyche, we might see these in figures of the Greek pantheon, particularly the Olympian deities, or in the Norse pagan traditions, the gods that were known as the Aesir, as well as we also see these with the Asuras of the Hindu traditions. And I'd also suggest that the figure of God in the Abrahamic cosmologies would be one of these celestial entities. So while conventional narratives really wouldn't recognize the existence of non-physical entities at all, I suggest that they in fact inform the very fabric of our situation. And not only, like at the top layer, definitely more of these celestial entities, but these other entities as well, I think very deeply inform. As some of you know with Gebser's work, the magic and mythical, even though like we sort of kind of transcended and included those, they're still operating. They're still very strong. They're just in more of a background position. So I would say the same thing, that terrestrial and extraterrestrial entities that have been incorporated into the human psyche to some degree or another still are exerting an influence, sometimes quite strong and sometimes really good, sometimes not so great. So according to Gebser, in the modern period, mental consciousness, it becomes very bound up in duality, in measurement and analysis. So in looking for the presence of these celestial entities, we might see them in such things as our instrumental technologies, our immortal corporations, national security apparatuses, refugee camps, power grids, centralized and abstracted economies, and even in the quantitative sciences. So anything that's particularly concerned with like centration, the centralization of something, or concerned particularly with boundaries, or concerned really strongly with self. These things that are manifestations in our society that we can see, these are manifestations of the human psyche, but not just the human psyche as it's incorporated these entities, I'm suggesting. So I further suggest that in these contacts with these non-physical entities, some of these entities are brought into mutualistic or symbiotic relationship. And this serves not only to dampen the energetic perturbation that occurs when the human species encounters a non-physical species originating from outside of the human psychic system, but it also allows transcendent non-physical entities to undergo a redemptive involution into deeper immanence. So the entities themselves, in this symbiosis, it's not only yielding new faculties of consciousness for us, but for the entities themselves, it seems that possibly they're being redeemed through their contact with the immanent. So we might see this, for example, in Jung's Answer to Job, where God is redeemed through his involution into the human psyche, through this process of incarnation. It's actually redeeming God. an earlier structure of consciousness might have seen these symbiotic entities as helpful spirits or tutelary deities or as the god of a given people. As modern peoples, though, we might see them, I think, more as like our sustaining virtues or our universal values. So whatever we think of as modern peoples as being our most precious values, whether it's like freedom, equality, tolerance, justice, uncompromised creativity, universal love, reason, the pursuit of truth, whatever it is, I'm suggesting that these values might in fact be these non-physical but very real living presences, and that these are informing our global civilization. So from a personal or mystical perspective, again, we might think of them as personal daimons or muses or guardian angels. But from a more cosmic perspective, these entities, we might think of them as archangels or godheads or universal archetypes. Or as the Eumenides thinks of them, we might just think of them as our resident aliens. So what is this thing that we call the collective human psyche that may have the ability to incorporate a non-physical entity? So I suggest that the collective psyche, at either the scale of a culture or at the scale of the entire human species, that it itself is the matrix that mediates the encounter with non-physical species. The way I see the human collective psyche is as a dynamic matrix of non-physical entities. That's all it is. It's just this relational matrix. Some of these entities are human and some are non-human. So in this way, in the foreground of the human psyche, you have all these non-physical humans, people that were alive once and are now discarnate, existing in the collective human psyche, existing discarnately as what we might think of as ancestors or as past lives. And then additionally, in the background or the periphery of the collective human psyche, you would have presences that are non-human, non-physical entities that have become introjected, incorporated, internalized into the human psyche. So a religious or a mystical or a shamanic tradition, it might think of these entities as being helpful spirits, primal ancestors, saviors, or other mythical figures. Some of these beings, though, that are part of the human psyche, they might be considered to be more problematic. And so people in the past, they might have thought of them as destructive titans, furies, or energy vampires, or demons. In our modern era, again, we might not think of them as being spirits, but we might think of them as deep collective pathologies or destructive unconscious complexes or unbalancing factors in the collective psyche. So what I'm suggesting is that as these entities are brought into sustained relationship, it's possible that some of them can come to exist in a less problematic relationship with the collective human psyche. And once their energies are stabilized, new faculties of consciousness emerge. So in the magic phase of consciousness, you might see a capacity for directed action, directing mana, and also power over fertility is a big part of the magic. And the faculty of imagination that comes about in the mythical, I'm suggesting might have arisen as these energies were stabilized. And then finally with the mental, it's possible that it was our faculty to engage in abstraction occurred as those entities were incorporated. So, what might this mean for how we might relate to the world? That's a pretty esoteric sort of bundle of information, so you might think, okay, well, what's the value in how we might relate to the world? So what I'm suggesting is our way of relating to the world. I suggest an intercolonial ethic. So an intercolonial ethic of the sort that I'm suggesting, it starts with the realization that there is no pure human and there's no pure self. Our worlds are impure. Our souls are impure. And by impurity, I mean hybridity. Greg LaHood, in his long essay, Paradise Bound, he speaks of hybridity as, quote, the mixture of things, processes, and phenomena, which are thought to be unlike, different, separate, disparate, and unequal, into novel cultural and religious forms. And he suggests that hybridization, it's not only cultural in nature, but it's cosmological as well. And it involves the hybridization of what he calls, quote, alien spiritual forces, end quote. So I suggest that the collective human psyche is prone to just this sort of process of cosmological hybridization. So if we accept the possibility that a significant portion of the collective human psyche consists of these introjected strata of non-physical entities, then we might ask, well, okay, what is the human in that case? So in attempting to locate some essence of the human collective psyche, we might imagine more and more archaic layers extending into the depths of psyche that precede even the existence of the human. So Jeff was talking tonight, earlier in his defense, about all these ancestors, these non-human ancestors. And so is the essence of our species to be found in these primate layers of psyche, or these reptilian layers of psyche, or these protozoic, like bacterial layers of psyche? Or, on the other hand, could we relocate the essence of the human in these other entities that originated in a transcendent space, these transcendent powers that in some spiritual narratives have fallen from the sky and in their mingling produce the unusual hybrids that we know as ourselves? So more from like these more terrestrial forces or these more celestial forces? Well, I'm suggesting both. I'm suggesting that we are this kind of symbiosis that has arisen at this very fertile area of contact between the physical and non-physical worlds. So if non-physical encounter between the collective human psyche and non-physical species, if it's not only possible, but perhaps ubiquitous, what does this mean for our identity as modern peoples? How much of the modern mind has been conditioned by its encounter with the spirits of its own ancestral lands, as well as with the lands of other peoples, or even by spirits that are not of this earth? As modern people, how much of us is tyrant god, or sublime nymph, or primordial serpent? How much of our psyche, how much of who we are derives from the psyche of trees, or sugarcane, or cannabis? How much is mushroom, or bacterial? How much of us in this room right now is the interjected psyche of the great mountain chains, the rivers and the oceans that define the contours of the lands that our ancestors walked? How much of us is the psyche of planets, galaxies, or the fabric of deep space? We can look at this process of hybridization in these long spans of time, going over millions of years, or we can look at it in shorter spans of time, over the hundreds or thousands of years. And in the hundreds or thousands of years, in that shorter span, I'm suggesting that our religions and our philosophies and our ways of seeing the world could have also originated out of these hybridizing contacts with non-physical entities. The intercolonial ethic that I'm suggesting requires one to simultaneously colonize and be colonized. This means unfurling oneself into others while letting others unfurl themselves within you. Unfurling, I'm using that term as meaning expressing oneself authentically. Knowing that authentic expression, it always carries with it the risk of hurting others around you. So in our psycho-spiritual life and our practices, often we're proceeding in the inverse way. When we're expressing ourselves, we're expressing ourselves from an inauthentic self that is not our own. Basically, we're expressing a doctrine that has colonized us. And when we have an opportunity to be colonized, to be completely entered and reconstituted by fresh new energies, then we fiercely resist. So this is sort of we're doing the wrong thing at the wrong time, sometimes. So if we're to speak in authentic expression, an intercolonial ethic invites us to speak with what Marina Romero calls living words. Much of what we say, it's regurgitated, prepackaged ideas that come from doctrines or ideologies and theories that were once very vital, but are now stagnant and half dead. These doctrines have colonized us in a very real way. I would suggest in some kind of participatory and active way, we could say this is an ontological colonization. It's not just a metaphor. Because of our cultural and historical situation, we're particularly colonized by certain doctrines. Certain doctrines that they reduce everything to one principle. And some of these principles that we often reduce everything to might be the principles of wholeness, truth, light, oneness, universality, non-duality, consciousness, spirit, the divine, or love. And many of us, we want to put one of these ideas, one of these principles, and say, okay, this is the principle which I'm going to anchor right at the center. And we're going to explain everything in terms of that principle. I'm suggesting that we don't do that. I'm suggesting that we gently disentangle ourselves from insisting on any one principle, on practicing this kind of reductionism. On the other hand, there are living systems, living non-physical macroorganisms, living entities that we actually need to let unfurl inside of us. We need to relax our defenses and surrender parts of ourselves to make space for that which is foreign and we might experience as being transgressive, to make space for that fresh new life. In other words, we need to get colonized. So practice of an intercolonial ethic, it requires a constant discernment, a constant repositioning. One is always off balance, far from equilibrium, and at the edge of what is acceptable. How do I colonize? How am I to be colonized? Thank you. Okay, so Q&A. You can relax a little more. I can relax.
So we have a microphone. If you have a question, we're going to pass this around.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Since I'm first in the line.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in there.
First of all, I really enjoyed your talk. After a few years, hanging out with you, eventually I noticed what are you talking about.
Thank you.
So I have, one, couple of small question that you can answer it in as a one extended question. Okay. First of all, how did you came to this conclusion that those entities are related to those ages?
To those what?
To those ages, like terrestrial to magic, extraterrestrial to mythical.
Yeah, good.
And so I can deeply relate with the way that you are defining entities in as part of our collective consciousness. But you also mentioned that there are entities that kind of unobservable, but can be observed by other people or can interact with other people, like genies, So what is your explanation that some people cannot relate, cannot see, some other people can't see them?
Yeah, good, okay.
Yeah. And my last question is so I think all these are kind of connected. You can connect them in your answer. My last question is So the way that we are thinking and imagining, like our imagination can create some entities in the collective consciousness in the way that you define it. So, and these entities could be harmful for other people and could useful for some others. How we can colonize that.
Yeah. Well, these are all really good questions, and I devote a lot of pages of my dissertation to talking about these. To your first question, how do we associate like these entities with this age? So what I went through this inquiry narrative, and I took 300 encounters in non-ordinary states of consciousness, and I reduced them down to like 100. Picked the 100 like most relevant sessions, and I really like heavily edited them down. And then I went through and I just like laboriously went through and I must have done like 4 or 5 thematic analyses while the experiences were still unfolding, like during the months. So it was kind of like there was a feedback process there. And what I found was that there were these characteristics that keep showing up. And I got all sorts of wonderful charts if any of you are interested. I'm a fan of charts. What I found, what seemed to be that terrestrial entities seem to have been around on this planet for a long time. And they really they have this really vital, wise energy. Extraterrestrial entities seem like when entities would be like, they're like, we're not of this earth, but they had this really intense, like erotic energy. They wanted to like really get into your business. And when you had them, like when they would, like when they come into you, like you feel it, like this tremendous, like Cosmology of Love last year, I was just like, the lust that these beings have for this planet, just like it's incredible. It's incredible. Like, from their perspective, like this is an amazing place, and it inspires desire in an incredible way. Celestial entities were some of these were some of the more difficult encounters. Sometimes some of the most sublime, but also some of the more difficult ones, because there was more the sense of exploitation and corruption that could be occurring, and it was agency. What I felt, it was like agency without limits. It was the sense of just like this being coming in, like, I am infinite. I am completely infinite, and I'm just going to do my thing without being concerned of like, hey, there's like other infinite beings also here trying to do their thing. So these were the 3 characteristics, and they seem to be characterized by like these deep mana-charged things in the magical. The mythical, this one was, I feel like the social structures, the complex social structures that arose like over the last 10,000 years, my suggestion is that we developed these complex social structures because we were falling in love with this imaginal sense of the other. And we were doing that because we had come into relationship with extraterrestrial entities who were like really, really in love with the other, and like you could get lost in the other. And so you have these really complex interpersonal relationships that come up. And then finally in the mental, when you have these real like okay, we're gonna take over this place and I can like, build some empires. But also like we're gonna really get really efficient and we're gonna do things universally. That came up in the mental. What was your second question?
So the people who can see the observable.
Oh, yeah. Okay. This was probably the hardest part of my theoretical analysis. And we don't have time to get into it too much. But to give you the very short, concise explanation, I'm working from an enactive paradigm. And it's the enactive paradigm that was articulated by Jorge Ferrer. And in this paradigm, what happens is worlds are brought forth. And the thing that's really the amazing insight, and the thing that's kind of hard to get, is that you can have multiple absolute realities. So it's like the infinite yes. It's like, yes, and yes. Like your worlds are not compatible, and yet they both exist. And then I take that one step farther and say, not only do they both exist, they're prone to contact. They want to mingle. So there are certain worlds or certain domains that we're participating, that we're enacting. And if we're enacting that world in a certain way, we're going to perceive certain things, certain entities. Somebody else in another world, they're enacting a different world, and they won't perceive the same things that we perceive. There will be a lot of overlap. And this is I think one of the strongest critiques you can apply to Gebser's work is like, wait a minute, like there were all these people in like Mexico, what we now know as Mexico, and all these places, and then like people from Europe show up and like suddenly like, okay, people like the magical and mythical is over, like we're now like totally mental. I feel like Gebser doesn't really address that point very well. He just like it just sort of happened all over the whole world. But it's a very hard point to address. But the way I suggest it is that people are enacting different worlds, and that when they start coming in contact with each other, when these worlds come in contact with each other, they start co-enacting, and people get dragged into enacting other people's narratives, but they also kind of we pull each other in. So basically, enactive worlds, entities outside of your enactive world are invisible. Last question?
So how we can, like, when we create, by our imagination or
Yeah.
thought, we create entities that are not useful, or like they're not friendly with
Yeah.
others, and some other people also, create entities. So
Yeah.
how we can colonize all these,
Yeah, this
opposite forces.
Oh man, this is really at the edge of what I'm working with, and some of the more challenging things. I remember I was down in the cafe. It must have been like 5 years ago, and one of my fellow students in PCC, she asked this question, and it haunted me it's haunted me ever since the day she asked it. And she just said one thing. She said, on this soil, when the white people came to this soil and they encountered the Native Americans, where was Great Spirit? Like Wakantanka. Where was Great Spirit when that happened? And I was like, well, that's a very good question. And tried to make sense of it. And I feel like it's very much like that. And this is where I want to caution us against jumping into these reductionist explanations of like, it's all light and love and wonder. It's like, yeah, well, my tribe went from being completely robust to completely like annihilated off the face of the planet in the course of like 5 years. So what I feel like is there are tides and currents and very strong entities that give cultures a certain robustness. We might think of this in our modern day. The geopolitical structure of this planet is changing very quickly. Certain powers are no longer preeminent powers. Other powers are really on the rise. And part of it is that the Western discourse, and in some sense the American discourse that has dominated so much of like global politics, is going to have to start incorporating new energies that were cooked up on different lands. And I would suggest cultural psyches that are working with very different allies than what we're working with, and we're going to have to sort of bring that in. There's one word you use, Masood, which I want to discuss, and that is the word create. And in one night, in a state of non-ordinary state of consciousness, one of my allies came to me, and she's like an ancestor figure, and she was basically talking about what you might call like my anima figure. And she said, Alex, I want you to understand tonight, she is not a little thought form that you created. You came from her. She generated you. And I internalized that. So I think and I know kind of where you're coming from, Masood, and I don't think you were quite saying this, but that word create, we often talk about create your own reality. Oh, I'm creating my world. Yeah, we have the power as creators to do that, but we also have to respect the limits and the ways in which we're created. And so my suggestion is that although these entities are very nebulous, and yes, my personal biography really colors these encounters, and I think all of our personal biographies color our encounters with these entities, they still have a reality apart from us. Josh.
Thanks. Well, I want to thank you, Alex, for talking about such strange and magical things so clearly and with such understanding. I think that's really valuable. I also have 3 questions like Masood, but I'll go through them fast. One is why you chose the word colonization, since it has such a intense background. The other one was you named sort of these 3 different stages and on the different kind of entities that go along with them, and I'm wondering if you have some sense of integral energies and entities that might be coming next.
Good.
And then also you mentioned the idea of the limits of the immanent when you were talking about spirits of necessity.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear a little more about that.
Good. Yeah. Oh wow. Great, Josh. Yeah, those are 3 awesome questions. Okay. Intercolonial. Yeah, I was like, I hope somebody asks me about this term. It's a bit edgy. And I think someone who has lived in a culture that has been heavily colonized, and not just by non-physical entities, but like a culture that's been colonized by like other human beings, and watch their culture become something that might seem quite ugly. I think, definitely you might have some issues with like, wait, like you're saying we need to colonize, we need to be colonized? My culture has been colonized. And I've lived in cultures that are really on the edge. And colonization isn't a whole lot of fun for them. Why I'm articulating this, it comes from experiences in non-ordinary states of consciousness where I was really on the ropes, and I felt like an energy was coming into me. And I was like, this hurts, this is hard. And it wasn't, and healers who were working on me might be like, oh, this isn't yours, just let it go. It's just like, and I'm like, no, but this is me. Like I'm already in relationship with it. I'm not going to abort this relationship. But it's hard. And so I think, you look at our world out here and it's like, oh yes, like we've created so much, and yet like there's so much like suffering out there. There's so much there's a lot of ugliness. So I just want to honor it all the way to the depths. I don't want to go to anyone's suffering, anyone's historical trauma and say, yeah, but it's actually all just Maya or illusion. Just kind of get over it. It's like, no, it's like Eros is pleasure and Eros hurts at the same time. And this actually like dovetails to your third, the limits of the immanence. One of the things I like wearing a tie because it reminds me of this sense of like you're in this world and it's like being owned. It's like in this world, remember what's going on here. Remember you have been given this life and this life will be taken from you someday. And I feel that's like in the humanities when these gods are like coming in and it's like, and there's the spirits, they're called the Erinis, the Furies, and they're just like, they're just these really hardcore, like torturous forces. I feel that when celestial entities, that we all are these celestial entities, when we come into this world, we encounter this kind of engulfment, this constriction. We're like, wow, I was like this multidimensional being, and now I'm like, I have to go poop, and my taxes haven't been paid. Like, this is where the work gets done. Like, this is it. Like, all of us who are on the dance floor right now, I suggest, like, we came forward and we are the courage of what we left behind to come in, to encounter the limits of the immanent and to work in limits. This is where the wisdom happens. Krishna, he says, he's like talking to somebody, and he's like, the difference between me and all of you is that I'm in control of all this, and I haven't forgotten that this is all Maya. And I felt like, man, if Krishna was telling that to me and being like, I know what's going on, and Krishna also says, I have the ability to control Maya. Like, I can create whatever reality I want. It's like, well, huzzah to you. like, I'm the one here doing like the much harder work. Not only have I, to some extent, forgotten that, but I'm actually experiencing those limits. So it's difficult. I want to honor that difficulty. And at the same time, we get to participate in this tremendously erotic dance that comes once we enter into relationality. When you're infinite, as a celestial being is, there's no relationship. I mean, you're just infinite, I'm suggesting. But when you start dropping into these living layers of reality, you are really, the sensual delight that comes with it is hand in hand with the suffering. But it's, in my experience, it's more than worth it. Second question?
Well, I guess the third one now, I think we swapped.
Good.
Is integral, yeah.
Oh, integral, yeah. I've sort of like bracketed that. It's like, I don't want this to get more complex than it already is. But the thing, I want to point out something in Gebser's analysis that I feel could be a little iffy. Gebser, I suggest he's still operating from the myth of the fall. Those of you who are familiar with Gebser's work, he starts out with an effective and vitalized phase, and then it gets defective and deficient. It becomes deficient, and it's vitiated. It doesn't have life. So right now, supposedly, we're in the vitiated phase of the mental. We're completely obsessed with counting everything, and the integral's kind of getting going. But I think that's an arbitrary thing. I actually think, yes, I do think that happens, but I think the opposite process is also happening. The initial hit of with these entities, it creates, like in systems theory, it creates an energetic perturbation, and it's just like all hell breaks loose. And only after like hundreds and thousands of years, these energies are incorporated in what systems theory, what we might think of as a dissipative structure. And the perturbation is dampened, and these higher order, more complex structures emerge in the psyche that is being encountered. So I think right now we are encountering, a wave of integral entities. Gebser would suggest that like it started with the Renaissance and with a more a-perspectival way, a way of looking at things from like multiple perspectives at the same time. And much of what the problem is right now, much of like the chaos in our world, the suffering in the world, it's because the integral is coming in and it's shaking stuff up. And we haven't brought the integral entities into symbiotic relationship yet. And when we do, it's going to be fantastic. We're going to have new modes of consciousness that emerge. Matt?
I really like what you're doing with Gebser, and I want to kind of carry that forward a little bit. One of the things that Gebser doesn't do is provide even a theory or a sense of what the cause of each mutation might be. He explicitly brackets that question.
He does, yeah.
And just deals with the phenomenology of the shift.
Yeah.
Like this is how human expression changes and human consciousness changes, but he doesn't, he talks about the Earth's movement through different sectors of the galaxy, and maybe that has something to do with it, but what you're providing here is actually that theoretical causal structure that can account for why these mutations happen. And I think that's a beautiful thing. It really helps to, shore up the loose ends of this evolutionary picture. And then another thing that Gebser talks about is with the integral structure, it's not so much something new as it is the transparency of the other structures, right?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking that what's really trying to emerge here is harmonious, maybe is too strong a word, but a more mutually enhancing intercolonization of these beings which have already come into contact with us, right? And it's almost as if with the magic, mythic, and mental, the primevality of the magical entities, the terrestrial entities, is like the past, and the erotic entities of the mythical are like, your surroundings now in the present, getting to relate in a proper way. And in the mental, you're dealing with will, like what you can do in the future, right?
Yeah.
So we're trying to bring time, the dimensions of time, and the beings that rule over the dimensions of time together into some integral phase, right?
Yes.
So maybe you don't need to. There's no new being coming. I think where else do you go after you've reached the celestial heights, right? Or do you think that there are still, like, what I really like about the paradigm you're allowing us to see here is that, like, alien contact has already happened. It's been happening for a very long time. But do you think that could there be new forms of intelligence that we haven't contacted yet?
So this is so everything you said, like yes, that's so it, and especially like the past, present, future affinity. Absolutely. I will say this though. I feel like Gebser's idea of like it's happened and we're just like sort of recapitulating the past ones. I feel like there's still kind of this millenarian kind of thinking of like, we are at the moment when it's like even the whole operating system is just like discarded, and it's like even the rules of the game are over. I don't think so. One thing that I want to make explicit, it's not such an important thing, is I'm inverting the vector of evolution here. And boy, am I catching some flack for this. Can we go higher? Thank you, Jason. Can we go higher than the celestial? Wrong question. We've been going away from the celestial the whole time. So the thing, you start out with, like, say, God. God's like way primitive. God's infinite, relatively undifferentiated, and but also centralized, very centered at the same time. And then you have like a celestial being, but then you have like galactic structures coming into being, whatever that means, and I'm not too clear on that. But you have things become more refined. So it's sort of, if you bring in kind of more of a Teilhardian perspective of like, wow, it's more complex. And then finally, like, things hit the terrestrial, and it's like the new life form, like the Earth comes into being, and these are non-physical or what I would call transcendent beings coming down into deeper and deeper levels of immanence. They're not losing their evolution. It's not like they're giving up like what was like already very complex. They're giving up freedom. They're giving up boundless freedom and a certain sublime impulse. But what's happening is they're moving into immanence, and that's the next thing of evolution. That's where the action is, and they keep going forward. And then even after the terrestrial, you have like all the species on Earth. So like the humans are doing their thing over here, and the wasps are doing their thing over there, and the mosses, and even like the stones. Who knows how stones are evolving. This is all happening, and it's like, it's not like, okay, then let's like roll up the carpet and like the drama's over and then we all get to go back to being the celestial. No, we're just moving. forward. So this is really like, this is it. This is as good as it gets, and it's going to get better. You know, what it already has. Bill.
I'm not quite sure how. The microphone?
Yeah,
Okay.
there's one right there.
Okay. I'm not quite sure how you mean that you're doing the reverse. Thank you. You're doing the reverse of evolution. The way I see it is that we are. My personal example would be 30 some odd years ago when I started meditating. People were bouncing and all off the walls, and they were flopping around and howling and screaming and carrying on. And now when I go into an environment where people are beginning to meditate and I can feel the strength of the vibration, they quietly sit and they groove out. You know, I'm just using slang here, but what I'm trying to illustrate by that personal example is that it feels like the vibratory rate of the planet has shifted because there's more embodiment of, of those vibratory rates, and therefore the what I call evolution has progressed. Was I clear?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I don't hear. I mean, I'm not understanding what you mean by saying evolution. You're saying evolution on its head.
Yeah. Let me be more clear about that. I just didn't quite express that thought the whole way. What I meant was the way that the vector is oriented in Wilbur and like Vedanta and many other systems. What I'm calling celestial entities that are higher dimensional, basically are more evolved, and that or Aurobindo as well, sort of like these higher dimensions, they unfold themselves into deeper immanence, and then you turn around and like the whole adventure of evolution is going back. So that emanationist paradigm of like there's a pure perfection that's emanating itself in more and more degraded layers of reality. The vector is going one way. So that what I'm suggesting in my model is that no, the vector is actually going the other way. Source is whatever source is, and I would say higher dimensional freedom is basically evolving forward more and more complexity, more and more evolution, whatever that is. So I agree with you that they're like, yeah, there should be this sense of like, yeah, things are new capacities are coming online. I will say this though, that I feel like things aren't necessarily always just going to get better and better. I think that's like that's the myth of progress. And I kind of want to integrate both the myth of the fall, myth of progress, and the way I do that is it comes from like the relationship between different foreign realities, relationship between people, the interpersonal relationship, or the relationship between one world and another world, and that there isn't really a vector of like are things getting better and better ultimately, or are they getting worse and worse ultimately? No, it's just things are developing new relationships.
I love your use of oceans and waves and fluid dynamics and watching the currents go back and forth, and then sometimes high tide, sometimes very high tide, sometimes low.
Yeah.
In between the highs and the other high, there's oftentimes a low, which might be lower, than.
Yeah.
I mean, right now we're experiencing some interesting things around Planned Parenthood and what that represents and stuff like that as an illustration. So, and yet I personally witnessed what I just shared in terms of looking at some of the beings on the planet, who when they came out, they were crawling up to the guru's chair, they were chanting, and they were doing a bunch of things that 20 years later I see them walking around doing things that share that they're old souls, you know. So, not trying to say it's all one way, but I do see some of that. So that to me is evolution manifest. So I'm trying to hear how you see that it's flowing a different way. I see currents, cross currents, ups, downs, ins and outs.
Yeah.
But it still seems like there is some large segments that are progressing, what I call progressing. You know, it's like Sri Aurobindo said that the idea was to go to cosmic consciousness, but also to step back at truth consciousness and manifest that on this plane. I'm just saying that I see more candidates who could probably do that. That's my perception.
Yeah. Good. Do you want? Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thanks a lot, Alex. Great talk. Two questions. One was kind of relating to what he was saying. You used the word redeemed, that beings would be redeemed by what? Contact with?
The imminent.
Redeemed from what? Like, how are you using that word redeemed is what I'm wondering.
It's again, it's a slightly provocative term, and it's slightly, I'm inverting it. Usually the idea of redemption is like, I am this fallen creature, and through my contact with a more transcendent reality, I can bring in the supermind or the one, and then I will be redeemed. The dark, immanent body will be redeemed. So I'm reversing that. The way I think of it kind of like when I watch children. Sometimes it's like these children come in and they're so luminous, they're so radiant, and they have this sense of like, you can see like, wow, you really don't have any sense of limits. Like you are an infinite being. Like I may not think you're an infinite being, but you are. Wow. But they can also be, children can be very self-centered. And if you've ever taught like very small children, they're always like, they're hurting each other, and they're not respecting each other's boundaries. And I think of it, it's like a whole bunch of infinite beings like colliding into each other and being like, oh, and then they learn and they get a sense, and then suddenly, like over time, they're not quite as infinite. They're a little more finite, but they respect each other's boundaries a little more. So that's what I think is happening. Is like God or Brahman or the non-dual, like it's coming into this world, and it's like, ooh, it hits its head, and it's like, ouch, like that really hurt. And then over time it's like, oh, like you also hit your head, and oh, let me try not to like bump you either. And then this relationality develops, and this mutual pleasuring develops.
So it's almost like being redeemed from oneness.
Yes.
Okay. And I like the stories of, your actual stories of your encounters and your research. Did you ever do any work consciously, or did it just happen to actually contact what might be called your higher self, your soul, your own? There's some people that refer to it as the monad, you know. Did you ever, did that happen?
No, it's funny. I've got some work I need to do around this. In a lucid dream state, what I think you could call a higher self contacted me, my higher self. And it was very sublime. It was just like, wow. And it was actually like very canonical, what you read in the literature of contact with higher self. I haven't, like, it's been hard for me to gain some traction around that. And I'm inquiring into that. One of the things, the way, just in terms of like the cosmology that I'm working with, I see that we don't have one soul. And actually, this was a conversation you were telling me. I got this idea. This was inspired by a conversation I had with you about a year ago. You were telling me about a woman who was in like some Southeast Asian shamanic healing thing, and he said, we all have 12 souls, and like you've lost like 11 of them or something like that. Yeah, Joy told me that story, and I was like, that's very interesting. And that actually, that's kind of the way I think about it. I feel like we don't have a monad, a one thing. We have, I like the number 12. Yeah, how about that? We have 12 of these, basically 12 different kinds of higher selves. And they each have a very different inflection. And one of them, it's kind of, its special inflection is sort of to be the central, like the self that really, like the thing that gives us identity. I sort of think of the higher self is whatever, I have my identity, and whatever came into this world to really like maintain my identity, that's my higher self. And I feel like we have a soul or a higher self that does that. But there's a lot of others that are also doing things that are very different, that are sort of on the same plane, if you will.
Oh, we're just passing it around. Hi. I just want to say that I can't overestimate the importance of this work philosophically.
Wow, thank you.
I mean, really.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of what it does to Kant, it's just extraordinary, and it's just in the sweet spot of the zeitgeist regarding hybridity. You know, I mean, it's really where philosophy is going, and you're right in it. And it's just beautiful. It just feels affirming. You know, it's where posthumanism is going, which is right at the edge of philosophy right now. It's what I'm involved in. I mean, it just seems like this is the story, right? This is the story. But we all have different expressions for it. Yeah. So just
thank you.
Really beautiful work. And what I wanted to offer, and it kind of responds to something you were just asking, Joy. I mean, just for example, in terms of its importance, in terms of philosophical doctrine, I mean, we understand that for the Greeks, you know, I mean, it came from the Greeks that the idea was when the celestial came to the planet, they descended. It was a fall, right? So that came from the Greeks, and then the Christian theology adopted this idea and doctrine that it was a fall, and it wasn't just about falling from a height. Symbolically, it was about falling into inferiority.
Right, yeah.
And what you're saying is something else. So it's a complete revision of that. Yeah. So it's deep, man. It's deep. It's good.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm interested in how the faculty have received you, and how your committee have received you, and are they excited? Are they speaking like this? How much pushback have you had? What's been your experience?
Wow. Yeah, great. A very timely question. A very timely question. So Chris Beisch will probably be watching the recording of this. Hi, Chris. I'm speaking to you from the year 2012. I just got my comments back from Chris Beisch, whose work a lot of you are familiar with, the author of Dark Night, Early Dawn. He's my second reader on my committee. Jorge Ferrer is my mentor and the chair of my committee, and then David Spangler is my third member of my committee. The dream team. If there was ever like a wonderful dissertation committee, the three of them are just absolutely fantastic. Whatever I did to deserve them, it must have been good. Jorge Ferrer teaches here, EWP. He wrote Revisioning Transpersonal Theory and the Participatory Turn. He was an editor on the Participatory Turn. He has an enactive paradigm. He's suggesting an enactive paradigm, a participatory enactive paradigm. I'm very much on board with that. I'm very much Jorge's student in that respect. So far, Jorge has been very, very supportive. Although I'm having a meeting with him soon, so we'll see just how supportive. But he feels that I'm carrying forward some of his work, and he's very appreciative of it. Chris Beisch, he gives great feedback, and he gives really, really precise feedback. And he was much more, I got a lot more pushback from him. And part of this is, I feel that whereas Chris and I are looking at a very similar domain. Chris tends to work at what might be called like the higher levels of reality, more transcendent levels of reality. I don't really work in those levels of reality. I work in what might be considered lower levels, more immanent levels. And but Chris and I we're both talking about the nature of the soul or the psyche. But Chris, I feel like he comes at this more from a mystical perspective. So the mystical tends to come at things, it tends to put the transcendent as being the source, the ground. I don't do that. The transcendent, it's just, so when we say that something's transcendent, we're just saying how far it is from me in layers of reality, or how far from a given world. So it's a great conversation I'm having with Chris. It's a great conversation I'm having with Jorge. They've both been really supportive. But I'm definitely getting tested in serious ways. The more problematic encounters I think I've had, and sort of what some of my prefacing comments were, what I was speaking to, is that I've working with other spiritual practitioners I would consider them to be more advanced in terms of their knowledge of technique and in terms of their experience. I have found that their interpretive frameworks are sometimes overly doctrinal, and when they're explaining things to me, it sounds like a somewhat undeveloped way of seeing the world, and I encounter this a lot, and I encounter it a lot in our general community. And it's a challenging thing when like someone's healing you, and often it comes up as like, get this thing out of you, and I'm like, I'm not ready to end this relationship. This is actually generating a lot of juice. This is where the evolution is for me. And in a hypothetical case, the healer's like, well, I don't know, I can't help you then. I'm an exorcist. This is what I do. So I really feel like this is sort of some of the new integral stuff, is rather than just being like, whoa, okay, this is us, this is not us, like we gotta keep the not us stuff out. It's more like, okay, we're kind of over here, they are kind of over here, they are kind of coming in, I kind of am them. This is not entirely an enjoyable situation. It's strangely pleasurable. Like, okay, let's roll with this. Yeah. Richard, and then Jason, and then you. Richard? What's your name?
Oh, Cameron.
Cameron. Okay.
I have thank you very much for your presentation. It was brilliant, as always. But I'm curious about these particular moments, these hotspots in human evolution that you linked to Gebser. And what I'm curious about is sort of if I would zoom in onto that moment when the transition happens, what specifically occurs in that moment. What I'm curious about is, because Gebser sometimes mentions a single person in which that evolution occurred.
Yeah.
And you were speaking about the collective human presence.
Yeah.
But in that moment, there's like almost like a focus on a single person, and then afterwards there's a wave that is created from that moment.
Yeah.
So is it possible that a single human somehow was prepared to step into that relationship?
Yeah.
Which begs the question, is there something that initiates the contact within human consciousness? And I'm thinking of Steiner, who speaks about Mary as a human being so purely present that the divine was able to descend into her.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there something that we are preparing, or should we prepare for that kind of purity so that we can invite the next level to encounter us? And then a more critical point I realized, reflecting on those 3 moments, is that these are human moments. And if I think about the Earth, there's been a lot of creatures before us.
Yeah.
You know, they're almost like the Earth story is not actually our story. It's like in the moment. You know, we're talking about the last 3,000 years.
Yeah.
It's like a blink of an eye.
Yeah.
What happened 540 million years ago when the fish came on the scene?
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
did the encounter? Like what kind of consciousness was present? What furthered evolution in that moment? Is there an agency within the center of the Earth that can push forward? And then last point is, like, I see the danger of believing that there's too much agency within us. I also see the danger to think that there's too much agency within the outside. So there has to be this sort of a balanced relationship.
Totally.
So I wonder if you can speak to those points.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good questions. I wanted to get to Jason and Cameron's questions as well. How much time do we have?
Till 8:30. So.
Oh, okay, sweet. So we got plenty of time. Good. Richard, what was your first question?
The first one had to do with the zooming in on the specific moment of transition.
Oh, yeah.
And that sometimes it happened, according to Gatsby, within a single individual.
This is, personally, I wrestle with this one a lot. Just the kind of like person I am, I always want to, I want to honor the individual. I want to honor the subaltern. I kind of resist the thing of like, oh, you know, the pure guru is over here and he'll like do it for us and he's better than us. I kind of resist that. So generally, and this is something Chris Beisch has sort of brought to my attention, is like these things, it's the individuals. We have a case for individuals modulating this, that it does happen. This individual here, like little flowers. It's harder to make claims about what's going on in the collective because like I can't like see the collective like really as a whole. I can sort of see the impact of the collective, but I can't see the collective. So my default position is like it's individuals that do it, and we're all equally ready for it. And I particularly I think about some people that I know who are in deep suffering, and I think about some people I know who have taken their lives, and I resist the idea that they're somehow living a less spiritual existence. And I want to invite us, to encourage us to maintain the humility, that it's a very mysterious process and it's very hard to see what's going on, and that we might think like, you know, this guy who's like, you know, screaming out on the street and, you know, seems completely like unconscious of what's going on. He might actually, like the leading edge right now at this moment might be like him or her. So that's sort of my default thing. On the other hand, I feel like, and a lot of what working in the non-ordinary state of consciousness is the collective psyche, whatever this thing is that we don't see, it's very intelligent. And there's all these sub-collective psyches in it. So I think about, you know, in our history as moderns, a lot went down on Europe, in Europe over the last 100 years or last 1,000 years, or last hundreds of years or thousands of years. And the psyche is working through projects. The psyche is working out projects. My suggestion is that every one of us in this room has beings standing behind you who were carefully planning on work that you might be able to accomplish in this. And that work, it's not just like, be your best self ever. It's work that comes out of certain alliances that were created. I think some of you have certain allies that really want you to bring out certain things in the world. Other you have different allies that are trying to bring out different things. And, you know, Europe is just one birthing ground of of modernity, the modern psyche. There's other psyches too that participated, and I think those psyches participate in us, even if our ancestral bloodline doesn't go back to Europe. It doesn't matter. I think that there's a lot of different places on the earth that are working stuff out, and there's also trauma. I don't think our collective psyche is like, it's like all-knowing. Like, oh, my wonderful like team of entities that are so like above it all, and if only I could listen to them more. No, they have their own things that are going on, and sometimes you're like, huh, am I sure I want to like carry that forward into the world? So that I feel like it's sort of, it's the individual, but we really need to listen to what's going on at the larger in the larger milieu. Second question?
There was one element that was connected to Steiner and his discussion on Mary and the purity within human consciousness, being able to invite. The second one was a little more problematic, that was had to do with that this is a human story that is told.
Oh,
but
yeah.
The levels
Yeah.
all occurring within the human, and then when I reflect on the Cambrian explosion, I'm thinking almost like that was the Big Bang.
Yeah.
You know, real like a little, you know.
Yeah.
Can I add something to that? Please. Just because you're looking backwards with that question, and I would also wonder what you think about that in moving forward as well with these entities and humanity's relationship to the earth in the future.
Okay.
So moving forward with this in that relationship.
I wish I could draw better, but like it's basically just moving from like a 2D to a 3D, or like from a 3D to a 4D perspective. Some of you have heard about my little theory about or hypothesis framework about localism, that instead of like layering reality like higher dimensional and lesser dimensional realities, that it's more, it has more to do with, it's like a sphere with different things radiating out. So it's kind of I'm inspired by Teilhard a little bit in this, the idea of like entities moving across a sphere and then conjugating with each other. So they like come into relationship. So you're sort of speaking to the immensity of time. And it's like, hello, like humans, like what's all this drama? Like you're this tiny little like sliver of infinitesimal amount, and you know you're only going to be on this planet for so long. What's going on? And so what I feel is that we want to honor our placement in time. I think we want to look back these millions of years. And when I think of all these species, like the stuff they went through, the dinosaurs, dinosaur sorcerers, what were they up to? What were their shamans doing? I mean, they were around for 67 million years. I mean, you got to imagine, like, they've left some interesting stuff in the subtle worlds. It's like, yeah. So absolutely. And the other thing is these go all the way back. This is just absolutely what Richard's saying. This is just a tiny little segment. Before the magical, there was like, if the magical goes back to, maybe 2 million years at most, absolutely, like the farthest back time to like the beginning of the archaic. Well, we can subdivide the archaic into all these different things, like, the hominid, like what was the whole thing that like created your first hominids? Okay, what was the whole intercolonial non-physical encounter that led to the primates? What was that led to reptiles? And that's kind of what I was evoking when I was thinking all these strata of psyche that went through. So yes. But I also want to say, like, we have this certain perspective we're looking out from. And I think it's okay to celebrate, like, hey, our last 200 years of history. Like, hooray. Like, that's really important because it's close. It's close to us. And I think there's sort of this, as things get farther and farther away from us, those morphic fields are more, their effect on us is less significant. I want to honor it all the way down And when something like, in a non-ordinary state, when some kind of like reptilian sorcerer pops up, I'm like, okay, like, yes, I'm new to this planet. Like, hi, tell me what's going on. But at the same time, I want to also honor of like, hey, we're the humans. Like, here we are. Like, check us out. Like, we're beautiful, aren't we? Like, knew that.
I was watching an episode just recently of The Wonders of the Universe, a brilliant British physicist, and he went to an island where a certain sea turtle comes on a single night of a year to lay the eggs, and he was waiting there with excitement. And then he says that these sea turtles have done that for 240 million years.
Yeah.
And at that moment, just, the turtle could have cared less about him or the camera.
Yeah,
and I was thinking, like,
Yeah.
rightfully so. There's this young child, the human, next to the turtle, and the turtle has been doing it it's like the turtle is like a rhythm of the earth. And I was just curious, what kind of entity do you attract when you become a rhythm of the earth?
Yeah. Well, that, I think a lot of, in the magic, we were coming into contact with entities that were very deep in the rhythm of the earth, and they shared some of their juju with us, and it's like, wow, like we owe them a lot. Thank you. Jason, Cameron.
I wanted to thank you for your talk too, and I was interested in the chemical aggregates that become molecules, specifically of DMT, lysergic acid, ergot, fungus, and the alchemistry of Banisteriopsis caapi and Psychotria viridis in the human stomach. Alchemical chemistry is actually an inherent spirit of the Earth planet itself, and spirit meaning it's a disembodied consciousness that needs to like manifest in those molecules, but also needs human consciousness to be manifest. And you were talking about the Earth spirit and its journey, and I feel like we are those individuality vortexes that are like the planet's eyes.
Yeah.
And even in like a Lovecraftian kind of sense, like it's not just good or bad spirits, but just like weird, and that's actually around us all the time. And a more inherent aspect of our reality is kind of like vectorship of embodiment, where everything really is related, and like somebody else's pain literally is your pain, and everything around is like literally part of all of us. And unfortunately now our sociological mainframe doesn't let us live like that. Like the concentration of an ego is kind of like how we're supposed to function here, and it's almost like advanced schizophrenia to live like in that vectorship state of mind.
Sure. Yeah.
But I also see after he's demonized, Aleister Crowley's Thelema, Love Under Will is like the mental stage of possibly getting back to that. Like right now we're in that mental stage, and then at some point that, I don't know, fraction could be reversed to love over will. And that I actually also feel that there's a part of humans that are alien or like extraterrestrial in ways, and that when you talk about the water themes or like consciousness itself, and just actually comes back to aquatic origins. Yeah. So it challenged the terrestrial part of it, because not only are like we mostly water, but the planet is, and our cerebrospinal fluid is all like pure water. Yeah. It's like an elixir vital or something.
Yeah.
And that I think the best thing we can do right now is to you can change reality by like living that vectorship of relationship to each other. It's not something that can be taken away through like the monetary schemes that are really trying to put people in a like confinement. I think that something like that can steer it away from that.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, a lot of great stuff there. It's like you're totally getting like the terrestrial thing. It's interesting when I did like these thematic analyses. What came up under the terrestrial were these aquatic. It was aquatic, dragon, and like primeval. Those were sort of the three themes that came up. So there's really is this. I just love like that you're sort of bringing the presence of that. You know, this is the water world, and our deep ancestry. I mean, talk about deep time. Most of our ancestors were aquatic. You know, it's like relatively recent that, you know, beings came out of the water. Another thing, you're saying, like, not so much like good or bad entities, but just kind of like weird. That's kind of like what I'm getting at. It's not like good entities and bad entities. It's just like we're encountering beings, and like some, like the encounter is maybe like pretty close to home. And then other times it's like maybe like it's like really far out. And like I've you know, I think we've had those experiences where in unknown states where you're just like, what is it? Like, I don't know, I just can't make any sense of this at all. And I think it's like we're encountering something that's pretty far out. It's like a pretty far away epistemological horizon, so to speak. And some of them are more familiar. They give us more of a sense of like, oh, belonging, I know you.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the mental significance of the time, like reality we live in right now, the jinn or like have spirits coming into you is like, really a real thing, and you can even see it on YouTube where these extractions or exorcisms are done. But I really feel like a huge part of it is will. Like you allow that to come in to you at one point, and then even just go to City Hall. There's like aquatic themes all around the side of it, and I don't know, different like buildings all around different cities have like the serpent kind of themes too. It's like in the structure of our architecture.
Yeah. Thank you, Cameron. Yeah.
Well,
Town.
We're pretty close here. I'll just throw a couple things out there.
Last but not least.
All right. Oh, well, on behalf of myself and all the beings behind me, thank you for a beautiful presentation. Your care that you present this material with allows me to enter into your story and experience it from within, and allows my imagination to envision it clearly in a way that I can understand it and remember it and continue to consider it.
Great, thank you.
From my own experience in my life. So
that's great to
really
hear.
Appreciate the care that you present with. So I just want to say that, and then I wanted to continue this like ongoing discussion in this Q&A that we're having of, you know, what's happening over time and involution or evolution, you know, what's happening at the crux of these mutations, these magical, mythic, and mental mutations. And I just, in relation to the relationships of humans to these entities that are entering into us, and how, you know, you said that the human psyche is really it's the place where the relationship happens. It's a mediator. And what I haven't heard mentioned is the term capacity. And I'm wondering how much do you feel is this about the human body, and before us other material bodies, growing the capacity to allow these beings to inhabit us or colonize us?
Yes.
Where do you go with that one?
Yeah, well...
And I have a follow-up.
Good, okay, good. I'll make this, make my first answer short but sweet. In terms of capacities, sometimes I experience in my belly, I'll experience in non-ordinary states of consciousness, I experience an uneasiness, as if something was being gestated within me, and it can be quite intense, dealing with this energy that's inside of me and that gets awakened at certain times. And it's exactly that, learning capacity, learning how to be, learning that capacity to deal with that. And, you know, it's, the non-ordinary state is, it's very mutable, of course, as we all know. And things what appears to one person one way will appear to another person in a very different way. So this is just sort of the way that I've dealt with this. But what I felt was like, this energy is mine, and it's sort of it's my responsibility to gestate this energy. At the same time as sometimes this energy, it feels like it's just, it's hard. It's very hard to hold it. And it's just this, I just feel like I just breathe through it. It's just breathe. Like, don't reject it. Just breathe. Breathe in, breathe in, breathe in. And sometimes, like, the imagery I'll see is like, it's pretty transgressive energy. It's like something is like on me, like piercing me. And it's just like, breathe through it, move into that capacity. So absolutely, I think this is like, if this is what the integral is, it's just like taking more. How much can we take? And when you can't take any more, like, okay, that's good, like, stop. But can you then rest, and then can you move in? Can you take more? Can you develop more relationships?
That's beautiful, very embodied answer, which I love. And it's also personal. And I'm wondering, on the collective level, if perhaps this is about psychic capacity or capacitating psychic energies, are not the cultural, everything that you talked about from the mythical phase on, when the eros started coming in, and we started coming into relationship with these beings, we developed complex societal structures, in relationship to these beings, religions, and then states, nation states, and then theories about what was going on, philosophy, and eventually to psychology, and even in the evolution of psychology. Are all of these perhaps examples of the collective creating systems or structures that can gradually contain more? They're rigid at first, and then they're getting less and less rigid until it really, in some ways, culminating in one sense, in psychology's evolution to the transference, countertransference relationship, where it's not about, it's gone from the individual capacitating that to capacitating it within relationship. In the understandings of the morphic field, and that we exist in relationship, that we've arrived at again. I guess my question is, would you agree that these systems that have been developed along the way, which have created doctrines that have held psychic energy on a collective level, have they served a purpose up to this point where someone can, like you, can emerge and say, I don't need doctrines anymore, I have my own body to capacitate my energy?
Oh, beautiful, Jason, beautiful. That's so right there. Like, that's basically, yes, with like 8 S's after it. That's it, absolutely. Jung has this idea that he talks about, where he talks about how dogma or doctrine and symbol, they are shields that protect us from unmediated contact with the numinous. And we need them. Like, if you have this like intense numinous encounter in a non-ordinary state, it really helps to be able to like make sense of it, to create an explanation for it. And for a community, it's great to create explanations, which become belief systems, which become doctrines, and they help shield that. And then, just to be able to, like, that's sort of an incubator as well. It allows us to incubate us, sort of protects us from too much numinosity, and then over time, just sort of like, it can be, the reins of the numinous can just sort of wear away at it, and then we can let go of it. And then I think like the body, just moving to this immanence, like, can the body help us regulate our contact with the numinous? I love it. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you very, very much.